Hey everyone, this is Ayana back with another episode of the Tiny Home Tours podcast. Today we are going to get to know Allison Shea a little bit more. She is the COO and co-podcast host for Tiny Home Tours. So thanks so much for sitting down with us today, Allison.
Thank you so much for chatting with me. I'm so excited about the new direction of the podcast, especially with you at the helm.
Heck yeah.
And it's really fun to be a part of it.
Woohoo!
Yeah. Yoo-hoo.
So, just as we did on my Get to Know You episode, we're going to start yours with two truths and a lie. So, tell us three statements, two truths, and one lie about your tiny living journey.
Awesome. I've got them. So the first one is I love compost toilets more than traditional toilets. My second is that my tiny house has been parked above 9,000 feet. And the third is that I've never regretted buying a tiny house.
Yeah, those are tricky ones. I think because I feel like there are two lies, but I'm going to trust that you didn't do us dirty.
She
Um,
doesn't understand the rules.
Tricked. I think that respectfully, and I do love composting toilets, but I do not think there is any way that somebody could love them more than traditional toilets. So I'm gonna say that that has to be the lie.
That's the truth.
No.
I do understand the rules. I I lived in my tiny house for I think close to 4 years, and I live in a traditional home now. And I bet it's because you right now traditional home toilets are still currently a luxury for you, but it's my like day to day, and so I have this immense guilt
Mhm.
after using a compost toilet for so long, flushing a toilet every day and wasting so much water. And I kept my compost toilet really clean, which probably helps. I did like a regular maintenance every couple weeks, brought it back to like sparkling spanking new.
Wow.
Um, so it was awesome for us. It worked really well. My kids were potty trained on a compost toilet. I love, and so maybe that is, I have amazing memories of them learning how to not only go potty on a toilet, but on a compost toilet with a, urine diverter and all of that. So I love them.
Yeah. It is really wild how you switch in your mind to like a regular toilet, something that is so ubiquitous and everyone is so used to being all of a sudden this source of like incredible waste. Being like, what are we doing? Why are we pooping into clean water?
Why do we
Who
do this? I
decided
don't
that?
know.
So it is true. I bet you're right. I think it's just because that at this point is more of a luxury to me than an everyday sort of sustainability womp womp
Mhm.
on my shoulder.
I love your question. Who decided this? I'd like to speak to the man in charge.
Right? For real. For real. All right. So tell us a little bit more about yourself, kind of who you are, what you do at Tiny Home Tours, but also just a little bit more about you.
Awesome. So I started out as an educator. Actually, I taught second grade and kindergarten and fourth through sixth grade environmental education, and then became a mom. And I became a mom to twins, and paying for childcare with twins is nuts and not nearly even close to a teacher's salary in Seattle, which is where my boy's dad and I were living at the time. So I stayed home with them for the first 2.5 years of their life and during my pregnancy, which was really rough. So a good 3.5 years. And Also became a yoga teacher. So lots of education in my background, but I got really burnt out in public education. And so when I was looking to go back to work, I was hoping to not go back into public education. And we were at the Tiny House Festival in 2018 in Colorado, and I did a tour with Chris, who was he's the founder of Tiny Home Tours, and he was also the only employee. He was running it all by himself then. He was doing everything, social media and filming and editing and everything, which I still to this day don't know how he did that then. But that was during the summer, and we did our normal thing. We filmed a tour, and it wasn't until October or November of that year, 2018, that he reached out and said, hey, you seem super organized and just like the kind of person that I need on my team. Would you ever be willing to come and work for me? And so I was his first ever hire. And back then, I think we had maybe 200,000 subscribers on YouTube and 2,000 followers on Instagram. I think it was very much kind of his personal page.
Yeah.
And so he's like, okay, that was my first job actually with him, was make Instagram our actual business page, make it, turn it into a business page somehow, please.
Cool.
And so I've seen a lot of growth. It'll be, 5 years this year. So it's been really cool to see the growth. I know it's his baby, but it also feels like my adopted baby. And I just love watching it progress and grow, and watching the tiny house movement grow and change. It's been a really cool progression over the last 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And 5 years ago, you were already in it. You were already kind of showing your house at an expo, which is wild. So tell us about how you got there. Like, how did you get into the tiny house? What sparked your personal tiny living journey?
So I will preface all of this with I know that this isn't most people's vibe. It's my vibe. Got me into trouble, as a kid, but I've learned to really harness it. I'm a little impetuous. I'm pretty impetuous. I've learned to harness it as an adult, and it does very much benefit me now. But getting into the tiny house was very much one of those impetuous Ally moments. We had moved to Seattle just a few years prior. Uh, the boy's dad was offered a job at Amazon. We were living in Colorado. We loved Colorado. I was teaching yoga. I was managing a Lululemon. It was everything that I like. I loved everything I was
Yeah.
doing. And we really wanted to have children, and we weren't getting pregnant. And we found out that Amazon pays for IVF. So we sold our house that we
Wow.
had just bought 10 months earlier. And within 2 weeks, we're living in Seattle. And the very next day, I had an appointment at an IVF clinic. I
My
was like
God.
ready to get going. Um, so we got pregnant with twins very quickly. IVF worked great for us. And I still very much feel for the people who, still struggle even after going through IVF,
Yeah.
because it's a really difficult process. And so we were living in Seattle. We found a home. We had the twins, within pretty much 10 months of moving there. And but it wasn't a place that I ever wanted to live permanently. I'm born and raised in California, sunshine. Moved to Colorado the day I turned 18, sunshine.
Yes.
I know a lot of people say that it's worth it to live in Seattle for the summers, but I firmly disagree. Um, 3 to 4 months of, yes, beautiful sun and beautiful days is not worth 9 months of torture. So I was so grateful to have my babies, and was definitely, not loving Northwest. And so when Kevin got let go from Amazon, we had watched a few tiny home shows. Um, and we were also struggling in our marriage a little bit with having twins and all of that. And I had the amazing idea that we were going to use the proceeds from selling our Seattle home to build a tiny house and move into the tiny house, and it would save our marriage and be this amazing adventure. And so we did it very quickly. We made the decision literally after watching a few tiny home shows and thinking that'd
Wow.
be cool. We interviewed one builder, decided that they weren't right for us, and then jumped on with another builder, Tiny Heirloom, and ended up recording one of those shows. We recorded the Tiny Luxury Show, um, and moved into our tiny house 4 months later. So they built it. We moved in 4 months later. It was a really fun process to be a part of the design process. I've learned that I love designing tiny homes
Nice.
and just thinking about how to utilize every square inch of a tiny space. That was really, really fun for me. And it was a really just thoughtful, cool process. And I'm very much like a type A. I like to organize, and I like things to work well for me and function well. So that was really cool. So we moved into the tiny house and started traveling really quickly. And I know that that doesn't work for everyone. And I honestly would recommend not doing what we did to future people. I would recommend interview quite a few builders, get quotes,
Yeah.
like, um, I'm really grateful that it worked out so well for us. But since then, since, being in the tiny house movement these past 5 years, I've heard horror stories about people putting back down deposits and never receiving tiny homes, or the company going under, or the company giving them a home that wasn't even close to finish. So I feel very fortunate. We got really lucky and things worked out great for us. I stayed positive, and getting into tiny house life was a very fast, speedy, cool process for us.
It sounds like an absolute whirlwind time in your life.
Yes.
Like this big
Mhm.
move and big life change in terms of getting pregnant and having the boys, and then jumping into tiny living all in the span of a year, essentially.
It was 4 months, I think, from when Kevin got laid off to when we moved into moved into the tiny house. We sold our home in
Wow.
Seattle, moved into Airbnbs, designed the whole tiny house, hired a builder, designed the whole tiny house, and moved in within 4 months. And our boys were 2.5 when we moved in. They were so little; they were still in
I
cribs.
can't even imagine. I really can't even imagine, but maybe it's like the best kind of chaos, you know?
I love organized chaos.
I love it. Yeah, I could relate to that too. So, after you got in the tiny house and you started kind of traveling, how was that transition for you? How was how was going tiny? Like, were there any sticking points for you in downsizing your life and traveling, starting to travel full time? And then how was actual tiny life?
So you and I have talked about this personally, but I think it's really important to go tiny as you and not try to be anybody else.
Yeah.
And what me, Allie, is, I can be a little bit of a girly girl. I really like fun clothes. I don't do the like black wardrobe so that you only need 3 items of each thing. I love ballerina skirts and cute hats, and I wasn't about to like
Let that
turn
go.
myself into someone that I wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all of our, quote unquote sticking points, we very much made work in the design. I had what I thought was going to be a walk-in closet. You can't have a walk-in closet in a tiny house. So it turned out to be a shimmy closet where I could, I had 2 rows of clothes and I could shimmy in and kind of like see what I had. But everything fit, which is what mattered.
Nice.
Um, and once I wanted to make sure that the boys had space. I knew that I wanted a traditional, bathtub. The boys were still doing baths at the time, and I didn't want to force them into anything that was uncomfortable for them. So we really designed a home that worked really well for a family right off the bat. And then getting on the road, the first night I cried and wondered what the hell we did. And oh my gosh, I think I just ruined our lives. I had one night of a meltdown, and the next day I woke up feeling great and never regretted it again. So it was a truth. There was a
Amazing.
moment of regret. Um, and once we got on the road, though, there were a few hiccups within the first week or two, just like with any, even traditional builds. There's things that go wrong in a build. We had a little bit of a propane leak we had to deal with, and just things that as we were learning how to live in a
Sure.
tiny home, learning how to travel with a home, things are also going awry. And we're always like, so that was a lot. And then after the first 2 weeks, it was kind of smooth sailing. The boys and I had a
Wow.
great time. I watched over the course of that year my marriage fall apart, which was really heartbreaking. But at the same time, I had these incredible experiences with my twins that most parents don't get, and that was amazing. And it wasn't like the tiny home created the problems in the marriage. I firmly believe now, and hindsight is 2020, that if you're going to move into any kind of a tiny space with your partner, whether you have children or not, you need to do a deep dive and like really be honest with yourself and your partner about how is our communication, what does our relationship look like, how connected are you feeling, because if you're trepidatious about any of those questions, you should stay in a bigger space and seek counseling. Don't think the tiny space is going to heal all of the wounds. It basically just puts a magnifying glass on any cracks that already exist.
Yeah,
Um, so there were bittersweet moments and sweet moments all wrapped into one.
sure. Yeah, there is this common theme, I think, for folks about tiny living or minimizing and downsizing as being sort of a mirror that comes really close in. It's this like mirror that's held up to you about maybe the things that you've been avoiding or areas that you need to work on, or like you're saying in a relationship, communication and there is, I don't know exactly what it is about the tiny space that does that. Maybe it's just the lack of convenience and everything being a little bit trickier, but there is this quality of, like, really intense introspection and, like, personal growth and discovery that seems to happen when we force ourselves into minimal amounts of square feet.
I'm getting the goosebumps as you say that because it could not be, more true. I don't, and it is interesting. I don't know what it is about just a tiny space that forces you to look at yourself in a way that isn't always pretty.
No.
And you don't have a choice for some reason. I've heard a lot of people talk about this. You don't. The mirror is stuck put to your face, and if you turn your back, it will follow you. Um, and that's a really beautiful thing. I like to call it my breaking open.
Mm.
There's been a few moments in my life since moving into the tiny house where I've had these moments of like breaking open and having to look at myself and look at things in my life. Moving into the tiny house was definitely one of them. I had another one back in 2019, where you fall apart and things get a little bit dark for a little while. But it is true. Things get really bright after the dark. The sun will always rise, and it rose a little more beautifully after those breaking open moments.
Yeah, totally. I think it was John Luke, who's another member of our team, who said the other day, like, when life doesn't fall apart, it falls into place. And I was like, yeah, that's that's what a lot of these conversations kind of circle around, and the tiny home being the catalyst for things to fall apart and fall into place for many, I think. Yeah.
All the things that aren't serving us kind of just fall away.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah,
Thanks for sharing your story with us. It's a hard one and, like you said, a bittersweet one, and also I think so powerful for people to be able to listen to and relate to. So, thank you.
absolutely.
So we talked a little bit about this and sort of both the relationship with your boys and your marriage, but what do you think kind of biggest challenges of tiny living and then biggest gifts are? Either like what did you learn about yourself in the cracking open? What gift did you get out of that? And what was the hardest part? And maybe it's like more of a practical thing. I don't know.
Um, the hardest part was definitely, like I said, watching my marriage fall apart and not, knowing that it was the right thing,
Yeah.
not necessarily not knowing what to do about it, but knowing what I needed to do about
Yeah.
it, being faced with that mirror. And then of course there are the regular challenges, like you said, of like we become so accustomed to everything being right at our fingertips in a traditional home. um, and there it's so different in a tiny house. You have to think about water, and we didn't have a solar setup yet, and so when we'd be boondocking, we'd get these big blocks of ice and put them in the fridge, because I really I just heard not such great things about those fridges that switch between propane and electric, and the fridge was between our bedroom and the boys' bedroom.
Uh-huh.
And so there was no way there was going to be a fire between me and my boys. And I know it's very, it doesn't happen all the time. It's not a regular thing, but it was still something I wasn't willing to risk. So, you have to think about, how am I going to keep my food cold? How I only have 40 gallons of water. How am I going to conserve that? Just these things that you don't have to think about in a traditional home. You turn on your faucet and
Water.
you can do all your dishes.
Yeah.
Not even thinking about how many gallons you're going through. And as I'm washing my hands, I'd be like 0.14 gallons.
Right. 1,000.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, those are all things that made me better and stronger. So I don't even think I can call those, they were good challenges.
Yeah, totally, points of growth.
Um, yeah. And then the biggest gift, like I said, I'm kind of a girly girl, and I was raised by a single mom, and so I had never picked up a power tool in my life. We hired a builder to build our tiny home. I was very much a part of the design process and loved that, but I'm not a, do it yourself kind of girl at that point. And one day we'd been traveling for, I think, about 6 months, and we were parked in Durango, Colorado. And I woke up one day and was like, that space above our kitchen cabinets is way too light. And being impetuous Ally, I had this vision in my head of what I wanted to create. And I went to Home Depot and gathered all of these materials. And I knew I wanted to create this like mountain scene, and I got right to work, and I had never even used a drill. And here I am, of course, we're living in a tiny house, so there's no space. So I'm like working under one of those canopies. It took me a month. I almost threw this piece out like 20 times. It got wet a few times, but I didn't. At the end of the day, after about a month, I had this gorgeous, like 7 by 4 foot mountain piece, the biggest piece
Wow.
still I've ever made to date. And it's still hanging, and it's awesome. And that's how my business, Satya Creative, was born. And so now I am a woodworker artist.
How cool.
A few friends asked me if I could make smaller versions after that. And so I started making them and selling them and shipping them. And it's grown since then. Now I love tools. I have a workshop. That's why I moved in a traditional home. I hope to one day have a tiny house with a workshop. It
Yeah,
just wasn't feasible at that moment.
sure.
Because I still love tiny living so much. But I have a laser printer now. I've gone all in, and then I've taught myself different software programs to run the laser printer. So it's just been this really cool evolution and a gift that I gave to myself that I never even knew that I needed
Yeah.
until I went tiny and woke up one day and those kitchen cabinets were too white.
I love it. It's so cool because there's the inspiration that tiny living provides, and then also all of the opportunity to follow that inspiration and then develop these entire like skill sets. There are so many people on the road that are like, I never made jewelry before I got on the road. I never made jewelry before I got on the road, or I never did woodworking. And so there's like the inspiration and time and space that tiny living gives you to really, I think, pursue things that are passions and like pull at those creative kind of threads of who we are. That's so cool. Tell
Yeah.
us, so you said your business is called Satya Creative. Where can we find you and see your business and follow along with what you're doing?
I'm on Instagram as Satya Creative, Satya, and then I have a website, www.satyacreative.com. I love doing customs. I think that if you're hanging something in your home, it should be something that really resonates with you.
Yeah.
And so I love for people to reach out and say, I love these colors. I want this quote or these lyrics in, this way. Or I love getting creative with clients. So I've done a lot of custom
How
work.
cool. Yeah, we'll drop the links in the show notes below so you can find Allie and all of her art on the interwebs. Um,
Thank you.
Coming to kind of the end of our time together, because you have been with Tiny Home Tours for so long and also in the tiny home space for so long now, I'm curious sort of how do you see the tiny house movement growing and changing in the next 5 or 10 years? Like, where is this all going?
Where is this all going? It's definitely not stopping, that's for sure. The tiny house movement was kind of born from the 2008 housing crisis. And at that point, there was a few fringe people who were doing it. And so nobody really cared. And people were using a lot of found materials and things. Since then, what has it been, 15 years? Obviously, a lot of regulation has been born because it's almost like a cool boulder rolling down the mountain that can't be stopped. And so, while there is some disadvantages to there being regulations, I mean, there needs to be regulations for safety. And it also means that people are recognizing that the tiny house movement is here and it's staying.
Yeah,
And so it needs some safety things in
sure.
place. And watching California legalize tiny homes like almost everywhere was such a cool monumental moment for tiny homes. They can just be parked in backyards in LA and then San Diego and then Sacramento. Um, so I don't see it going away. I see, them continue to regulate. I hope that there are obviously a lot of things that I hope that they continue to regulate and allow and approve in ways that are actually conducive for tiny homes. Because the reality is that a lot of people, yes, people are moving into tiny homes to live a more simple life, but it's also a very practical financial decision. And so I hope that we remove minimum square footage laws. So that does it's not a backyard ADU thing. It's I can have my own space there,
Yeah.
or I can build a community thing. Like I know there are a few single mothers in Durango, and we all dream about buying a piece of land together and being able to put our tiny homes on it. But right now, that is not a
Possible.
doable thing to do, even though they're legal in our county,
Hmm.
because they need to legalize them in a way that makes sense for tiny homes and not traditional homes.
Yeah.
So we've made a lot of progress, and there's a lot more to go, but it's all very exciting and good things. And basically, if we get emails in our inbox every day of like, how do I do this? How do I move into a tiny home? And they're asking, about zoning and things, and people from Alabama and places where they're not even thinking about tiny
Yep.
homes. So you need to show up and have your voice heard, and maybe create a group before you do that, so that all of you show up and have your voice heard, and people who are making decisions see the boulder rolling down the hill and want to get on and be a part of that.
Totally. Yeah, it is such a practical decision, I think, both in terms of creating a life that is more aligned, and like we talked about earlier, letting everything fall away, and also financially. Like my husband and I are in our like early 30s, and I'm not 30 yet, but I feel like I've been 30 in my soul forever. Um, but there's no way, if we were looking at the traditional housing market, that we could take that leap, even if we were stationary in some place and, we're working sort of more traditional jobs. There's really no way. And so I echo your hope of it just becoming more easy and more accessible and regulated in a way that makes sense, so that it's a viable option for all of us for whom traditional housing is not currently a viable option.
Yeah, and it really takes understanding, I think, our community specifically. Like the tiny house, van life, bus home community is very community oriented. It
Yeah.
was one of the coolest parts about living on the road was the community. And so if that were recognized, I think it would be more likely also, because I don't think I think if you or I had a preference and we were going to build a tiny home, I don't think you or I would want to put it on our own land alone.
No.
I want to put it on land with 4 or 5 other of my best friends
Yeah.
and build community and build a garden together and have sustainable things together. And so it's not only like understanding the tiny house movement, but also understanding our community, which is much more community oriented than other communities that I know of.
Totally. Yeah, that is the dream of so many people. I feel like right now, everybody that I talk to that lives in a tiny house or a bus or a van is talking about where can we find the land and how can we get all of our little cute tiny homes on that chunk of land together and create that sustainable, community oriented um, garden, like you were saying. Mm,
Yes.
yeah, it is. It's a worthwhile dream, that's for sure. All
Hmm.
right, so to finish, I think I'm going to ask you to describe tiny living, or what tiny living has taught you, in just 3 words.
So I hear your rules and I'm going to break them on purpose.
I knew you were a
And
rule breaker. I knew it was going to happen at some point.
we all are. You are too.
Yeah.
um, and I can't decide between two, and they're both 4 words. So
Maybe we could get 8 words then.
here we go. Here we go. My first one is surrender to the flow,
Yeah.
because I have it tattooed on my arm. It was a huge lesson that I learned having twins and just having to relinquish a lot of control. And it's a much more beautiful life when you just surrender and allow good things to come to you, and the things that are meant for you to come to you, rather than trying to force things or kick in doors that aren't your doors.
Yeah.
Um, and then my second one is, it's again 4 words. There are no rules. Moving into the tiny house, I've always like, I don't, I think there are people who are just born with a little bit more of like a rule
Like
breaker, like not rule
rebellious, kind
breaker,
of.
rule
Uh huh.
questioner. Yes. mentality, and a lot of those people go on to do like amazing things, and I've always been someone who questioned, well, why? and and then when I moved into the tiny house, it was this like idea that I always knew, but I finally felt in my body that there are no rules. No one is watching me, nobody cares what I do, and I get to write my own rule book for my life, whether that's in my tiny house or with my children, how I parent. And it was really cool and liberating feeling to have. So if I had to pick anything around tiny living and just like the lessons that I learned that I'll take with me for the rest of my life, no matter how I live, they're those things.
Amazing. I like them both. Surrender to the flow, and there are no rules. All right. On that note, we will wrap up. Ally, thank you so much for chatting with me today and helping us all to come to know you and your journey a little bit better. And yeah, we'll see you guys next week. Join us for another
Thanks,
episode of
guys.
the podcast. Bye.
Bye.